Okay. This has been a nice progression into some thoughts that I've had, and I hope that will, in fact, lead into our more general discussion, and we're doing pretty well on time so far. So reflecting back on what we've learned here, as Larry said, this is really in its infancy. We still have a lot to learn. Things are evolving rapidly. Prototyping makes a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of agreement, I think, not only in this room but more broadly, about the principles that both Pam and Candace have summarized here, and also some of the practical problems, like it's tough to put statistics into legislative language. And then there are some things that, frankly, we have a fair amount of variation in opinion about. Should elections auditing be done by some independent body? And I'm happy to say there's some interesting possible developments on that front. I think that one of the wonderful things about states doing, moving forward on this, is that that's where the federal system really shines, the laboratories of democracy. So with that, my own thoughts about what we could do from going here, we want to kind of spread this gospel, and we all along the way need to get ever more cooperation from state and local election officials. I think we need to build our information infrastructure and to provide the foundations for good administrative regulations and legislation. So here's some possible follow-on activities, and I'll just say a little bit about each of them and then open it up to discussion. We've suggested there might be some working groups on things like building a common vocabulary, things like building an archive of existing forms and resources, putting that on the web, coordinating our research and developing policies. And one of them that I think might make some sense is some state and regional counterparts to this meeting. That is, did some informal talking to fellow Californians, and it might be possible to put together a California election audit summit. We had a little discussion over breakfast this morning about possibly some kind of New England or Northeast regional conference that would do a similar kind of thing of bringing together state and local election officials, political science statisticians, and advocates. So let me say just a little bit about the possible working groups here. One thing that really would be helpful as we tried to start doing there is having a summary table of just what's going on. And that will obviously be a dynamic thing that needs to be kept up, because we keep hearing new things. I mean, I only heard about that Massachusetts activity a couple of weeks ago from Mark Halverson. Clearly, we need a glossary of election auditing terms so we have some common vocabulary. Probably be helpful to have some kind of web archive of all kinds of documents. And to develop model standards and legislation. Need to develop training materials and have counties and states share with one another things that they've done. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but it hasn't been very widely shared. And then it's been mentioned some kind of standards and forms development for how we collect information, both how official collection is done, say the way that Deborah Bowen spoke about collecting information on post-election auditing for the Secretary of State, but also how citizen groups like Minnesotans for election integrity went out and did their audit. We could have more of that that could be traded among the states, amassed and mined. And finally, certainly, our friends from the American Statistical Association, I think, have already done a great job of starting to provide some consulting and expertise on sampling and measurement. What kinds of resources could we share? Well, more face-to-face meetings. Hopefully, if we think this was successful, we may try to do it again. And perhaps even in the meantime, try to do it on the state and regional level. We intend to continue the electionaudits.org website to include materials from this meeting and go on with that. We do have an auditing email list server. If anybody would like to be a part of that, I'll send out email after the conference giving an opportunity to join that. There are these things called wikis. You may have heard of the Wikipedia, and you can do the same kind of thing to have a collaborative environment for uploading and sharing information that may be useful. Jill Hall has put together a good bibliography of election auditing resources, and it would be helpful to be able to add to that collection and other sorts of research resource lists. And we have a couple of good example online calculators. Howard Stanislavich showed his yesterday. That's up on the web. And so that people can sort of try out in real time how you might do this. As I say, here's a idea about doing this in the States, and I think that a couple of ideas about that. One is that particularly we found it very difficult to get state legislators to come, and as Dan pointed out, they have many, many other things to do. But if we, for example, held such a summit in Sacramento, in California, it's probably more likely we could get the legislators and more importantly their staff to come for at least part of that. The other thing is that we could have people from selected other states and national groups come and attend those state and regional meetings, perhaps even, if necessary, via the sort of remote video conferencing that we did some experimenting with in this conference. We need to get out and spread the word and get input in other venues besides talking amongst ourselves. I put down a few ones that occurred to me here. The National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Conference of State Legislators, and then the two associations I understand that local election officials attend. And actually, if after this, if people have ideas on that, please see me, and I'd like them to add to that list. In the way of data collection, if we can get a group together, we'll try to specify what kinds of data we need and what kinds of standard forms might be done to collect that. And a number of research areas have been proposed during the course of this meeting. I just put down a few here, but we could probably get more efficient sampling methods by working with statisticians and computer scientists. There's a variety of counting methods, as we heard summarized yesterday, and it would be really interesting to get some empirical data on the relative pros and cons of each of those. And maybe some statisticians and industrial psychologists can help with that. And finally, there's this business of how to change the norms for election auditing. I think as Candace particularly pointed to, more and more, it's going to be important to try to educate the public and the people who do this work that mistakes are going to happen, and that's okay, and that actually we ought to embrace people bringing those to our attention so that we can fix them. The problems really are with the systems. The problems aren't usually with the people. This is actually an area that's been studied, and one of the groups that hasn't been represented here, and which I hope to bring in, are people like Todd Laporte, who actually study administrative behavior, and particularly in places like the Federal Aviation Administration and the military aviation, where admitting mistakes is actually recognized as something that should be saluted and honored. In terms of policies that underlie this, as we said, there needs to be public access to data, transparency across all levels of the voting process, and last but certainly not least, the development of election tabulation and auditing rules and legislation, and that will be the topic of the upcoming Panel 8. The exciting Panel 8. Now, we have, I think, at least 15 or 20 minutes, if not more, to hear from people. Oh, please.